each one of my panelists to join me. Oskar Fröberg, William Della, Sabina Hemmi, and Moritz Maurer. I've been pre-warned that I said at least 2 of those surnames incorrectly, but that it was okay. So I feel very relieved about that. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about esports media and data rights, whether it's a minefield or a huge unexploited revenue opportunity, which is quite the saucy title. We'll try and live up to it. So, William, actually, before I dive into the topic, I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves briefly and to tell us all a little bit about their areas of expertise. Starting with myself, my name is Nicola Piggott. I'm the co-founder of The Story Mob, which is an esports-focused communications consultancy. I'm based in LA, but the company is in Europe and the US. So, Oskar?
Yeah, my name is Oskar. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of a company called Abios. We've been around for 6.5 years, and we're a data provider within esports. So we provide everything from in-depth data to live scores to different types of statistics regarding matches and tournaments. And we deliver that to clients all over the world, including betting clients, media clients, teams, apps, blogs, and different kind of platforms.
Hi, I'm Will Della. I'm a senior associate at Bird & Bird, international law firm. I think it's been around since about 1846, so I'm very much not the founder. But we do lots of stuff for various different stakeholders in the esports ecosystem, from media rights and sponsorship through to player contracts, regulations.
Hi, I'm Sabina Hemmi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ELO Entertainment. We do data and analytics for esports titles. Primarily, we're known for doing it on the web. If you've heard of DotaBuff or Overbuff, they're the 2 biggest sites by traffic for Dota 2 and Overwatch, and that's some of our work. But we also do second screen experiences, data, and basically any way you could do data.
Hi, I'm Moritz Maurer. I'm the CEO and founder of Grid. We are a technology platform designed to help rights holders in esports to unlock the potential of data, be it through distribution to betting on media, or using our data solutions to improve fan experiences across the broadcast and content, and ultimately create a more sustainable ecosystem for competitions and teams.
Great. Thank you, everybody. In case anybody's unaware, we're all very excited by data. That's what links us all together. So there's going to be a lot of hardcore data chat as we get into the discussion. To start off, though, Will, to come to you, when we think about media rights, which is one of the things that we're discussing today, what do you think are some things that we need to tackle when it comes to esports media rights, as versus what we've learned from the traditional sports industries?
I think one of the key differentials is the underlying IP position, for example. So there's no underlying IP in a traditional sports event for the most part, whereas esports is obviously very different in that the underlying game content is owned by a publisher, and that has a fundamental effect on the way it's broadcast. So I think it's quite a tricky media rights landscape to navigate for that reason. And we've seen, for example, with what happened with the Berlin Major this year, ESL One Genting last year, sometimes broadcasters think they might have acquired exclusive rights, where in fact they haven't. I also think that there's a sort of existential issue that could affect the industry around the way it's regulated. So there are moves to change broadcast regulation across the European Union so that video sharing platforms, being the primary medium by which esports content is consumed, could be regulated more along the lines of TV channels, and that would could dramatically affect the commercial model behind esports broadcasting.
Mm-hmm. Do we think that esports media rights as a whole is one of the largest sources of potential revenue that's being left on the table? And this is an open question to anybody on the panel, really.
Certainly, following the projections you can see out there by Goldman on Yuzu, it's projected as being one of the core revenue drivers. I think some map it even at 40% of the revenue for esports. I think our panel here is covering media and data rights, so I think data rights is something that's not recognized in the way it should be. Broadcast rights is certainly very interesting, and it has been, and we saw many moves of different competitions trying out exclusivity with different platforms, then going back to a non-exclusive approach. I think there's a lot of movement there, and it's a big nut to crack for esports in their ambition to mirror commercial models that we have in traditional sports, where you can extract more revenue from broadcast rights by, for example, introducing subscription fee models. And again, here we lead back to the data. Like if we saw what LoL did with ProView, this is it's very data-driven and enhanced viewing experience. So there are models out there. We think, I think, media rights certainly a very big one. In conjunction with data, it could be even bigger.
Mm-hmm. I think I just want to add like some clarification also for the audience. I mean, for those who might not be aware, I mean, we'll be talking probably a lot about both media and data rights, and in this case they're different. So when we're talking about media rights, we're speaking about like the broadcasting and like the actual sending of the matches online, which is probably even bigger than the data rights, which is actually, I mean, at the core of what most of us are working with. But like the data rights could be like just the actual information and statistics regarding the matches. But I mean, what's also interesting, and as Moritz said, a huge source of revenue is actually the media rights, which is the broadcasting.
Mm-hmm. And I think, unpacking media rights a little as well, what's so interesting about esports is that you obviously have the core live broadcast rights and your sort of core broadcast products, but then in the same way that other media and sports businesses are doing, looking at, for example, charging customers for premium content, removal of ads, that kind of thing. But then actually esports goes several steps further by doing things like sponsor drops in games, in-game purchases, in-stream purchases, stream aid, Twitch bits. And if you package that within media rights, then the opportunity is absolutely enormous.
Mm-hmm. So when we think then, because just to stay with media rights for a second before we delve into data and what makes an interesting broadcast. Media rights in esports, even in its short lifespan, has had a load of very contentious issues. And Moritz, I know we were talking about the Berlin Major and what happened there, right, with some of the sort of the restream issues. Do you still see it, and question for everybody really, but Moritz, maybe you could start us off. Do you still see it as sort of a battlefield?
I think what was mentioned at the start of the panel is just something to be aware of here. There's a private or listed company owning the IP to the sport, and they have their own agenda, and sometimes this conflicts to some extent with the aspirations of the esports companies running the competitions. And in that case that you mentioned for the Berlin Majors, it was revolving around a situation where a rights holder to the tournament was trying to protect their streaming assets and really also make good on their deliverable with their broadcast platforms. And the game publisher was more interested in making sure that their content is accessible to the fan base and the community, because this is what they really care about. So these are all, I think, case studies that we look back on in a few years while esports is maturing. There's learnings to take from, and at the moment I don't think it's very regulated at all. This is why we have these things happening, but I think there's a solution that will ultimately meet both demands and still protect the right to broadcast as an asset commercially.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I mean...
I was going to say, I think it's really interesting because it's a legal gray area, right? You ask who owns the media rights, the tournament organizer is like, well, it's our tournament, we get to broadcast it. You ask the game developer and they're like, ultimately it's our game, we get to do it. There's an argument that the performance that the players have has some legal right. The performance and commentary that the casters have is legally transformative, but most casters who broadcast for most tournaments don't sign an agreement because that's where esports is. Like, they don't necessarily sign a contract to cast a tournament. So it's a huge legal gray area. We'll see something contentious go down and a huge legal case will set precedent, but right now it's such a gray area. And I think there's kind of like a weird comparison to traditional sports where media rights are so large and people look at that and they're like, oh, it's the thing we haven't found yet in esports. We need to capture all this media right revenue. And while I think there's a ton of potential, arguably it has the biggest potential, the way that we're consuming media is changing. So there's so much in flux that it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes in the next few years.
Do we think a resolution is even possible when there's groups, like you brought up the example of a tournament organizer and a publisher, right? In that power dynamic, the publisher essentially has all the power, right? Because they could at any point deny the use of their IP, thus undercutting the tournament organizer. So do we see a resolution for media rights in that kind of environment, or does it have to come from, a more closed system similar to a Riot?
I think I mean, that depends on, that's from game publisher to game publisher. I mean, you all can jump in and say from your experience, but some of the game publishers are actually, like Riot Games, for example, with one of the 3 large games called League of Legends, is taking care of their rights and their even their data, their media rights, everything they're taking care of, and they're making sure that's monetized in the right way, etc. But then you have some other game publishers who are unwilling to work with like the esports media and data industry altogether. And then there are certain providers, like the example mentioned previously, where it's sort of a gray zone. And I think what we're all pushing for and what the industry sort of needs is more clarity around what is from the game publishers, because there's no question about it that the game publishers are the ones in power. They're the ones who actually decide about their games, regardless of who the tournament organizer is. But I think all of us would be even happier if we could get from all of the game publishers just some clarity around what who owns what and who has the rights to what parts and what can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think a solution is absolutely possible, and the solution is contractual, in that if you are a publisher entering into a contract with a tournament organizer, then when you are giving exclusive rights, what does that exclusivity mean? Does it genuinely mean you have platform exclusivity across all territories and no one else can see this competition elsewhere or this tournament? The trouble with, historically it's been Valve titles in particular, is that because they have in-game streaming functions which players or fans can just access and then stream themselves and add their own commentary to, that does naturally completely undercut that exclusivity. So as to whether those two things can coexist is difficult, but I mean, in theory, the solution is entirely contractual.
And I think it's interesting because that changes the power dynamic. When your favorite streamer is rebroadcasting a tournament, giving you better commentary and a better experience than you have when, say, ESL sold exclusive rights to Facebook for a while to broadcast, people didn't want to go on Facebook to watch their streams, they wanted to go on Twitch. So when people rebroadcast the tournament on Twitch, suddenly they're siding with their favorite streamers. And suddenly it creates this power dynamic where Valve, the publisher, who should have all the power, if they should have set precedent, they should have set clear guidelines, but they didn't. And now they're beholden to the community and the anger of the community. And it's remarkable what game publishers will do to cave to Reddit and social media.
On that point, do we think that, so it seems to me that the community needs some education, right? Because the community is used to watching their content on the channels that they like, completely free, and any variation to that plan is disastrous and catastrophic, right? But the truth is that without them contributing in some way to the upkeep of these tournaments, that's unsustainable in the long run. So do we think that the community needs to understand that struggle a little more, and the huge amounts of money that tournament organizers, just for one, are putting up to put on these kind of events?
I think what you're basically saying is there must be a revenue mechanism that makes a model where esports continues to be free and accessible anywhere viable. And instead of giving someone exclusivity and then ultimately limiting the exposure and also the freedom of the user to choose their preference. So there are models to do this. We are, as partner to Blast Pro or Faceit or Starladder, we've been just involved with the Berlin Major. We are working together with them to devise data-driven viewing experiences that can be enriched and that ultimately can serve as additional avenues to monetization, either by creating data-driven sponsorship inventory, which is built into the broadcast, or just makes stats and anything that's interesting to a competition more accessible for fans, or later turning this into something what LoL then ultimately built themselves in alternative viewing experience, but they leave it open for the users to choose if they want to opt in, if this is good enough for them to pay for. Mm-hmm. So I think it will need more of these case studies, and there are certainly models, and they can take inspiration from the engagement that is driven by stats in traditional sports, and there's certainly many viable options. And
I think that's a good jumping off point to start to talk about data a little bit more. Obviously, we have so many different heads here when it comes to data, but Sabina, I guess to come to you first, when you look at because esports is unique in the sporting world, right, because it has such a wealth of data that can be used to supplement any broadcast experience. You obviously have experience with this, having worked in and represented data within esports for 8 years. What do you think is critical about how you pull from data in order to inform, a viewer, whether they be new or
well, I think
well-versed?
esports is really interesting compared to traditional sports because you can literally get every user input, right? In sports, you have these complicated, developed over a decade kind of ways of measuring movement and measuring the pitch speed of a baseball and stuff like that. And not every sport is very technologically advanced depending on the sport. But in esports, from out the gate, we have a lot of accessibility to data, and sure, we can still use some of the same technologies like computer vision, but it's a lot easier to use computer vision to read a number on a screen than it is to try to measure someone's body, right? So it's inherently a lot more accessible, and then I think the user base is a lot more inherently tech savvy, which means for us, we have user-facing products. People are much more willing to get into the weeds with data, much more technically savvy with what they're going to do with the data, and I think that creates a unique experience to provide better data visualization during esports tournaments and contextualizing what's happening.
Another opportunity around this that's super exciting, and you probably have some experience there. In esports, we can very generally divide the viewership into groups, people who still play actively and who also watch, always with something in mind that they want to use the knowledge they gain from watching the pros to improve their own gameplay. And then you have a more non-endemic viewership segment, and for them it's more understanding what's happening and why something matters or why was this a big play. So contextualizing what's going on increases the accessibility of esports. But we can start here with very general data that's just contextualizing if someone's doing good or bad, to going really deep into stats that matter for people who play 6 hours a day the same game title and who know their stuff. And I think this is something we learned in our interaction with FACE at ECS, doing the insights, real-time contextual stats for the broadcast. The feedback was some group cared about the super in-depth, complicated, intricate stats, and some others cared more about milestone. This guy has hit his 1,000 headshots in the competition. They're okay, yeah, I saw he's playing good, and now I also know that this is in the data. It's a super interesting field, I think.
So, you can't, obviously there's multiple groups that you just mentioned there, right? And the challenge is to come up with a broadcast experience that's, deep enough and interesting enough to people on all ends of the scale. When you guys think about how you use data and how you work with, organisers, broadcasters to get data across, what are the things that you keep in mind when you're gathering? Is it, readability? Is it, are you trying to identify patterns? Are you trying to guide a narrative? What is it that guides your hand? And Oskar, maybe.
Yeah, from our end, it's we just want to make whatever. Because since we're a pure B2B company like Moritz, we just want to make whatever available to the client that they actually want for their users. And then with a lot of our clients, we try to work very closely because we're very knowledgeable in esports. And we've done a lot of projects with many clients. So we try to give them, tips of what to show or what to display or what kind of stats are important. But as Moritz said, it all depends on, what the integration is. Are we working with a betting company here who want to really look at the detailed data to create live odds? Or are we working, or is it like an esports companion app in your phone where you just want to follow your favorite teams and see the upcoming matches? Then you want just this more simple data, but perhaps broader. So it's kind of a hard question to answer. It's on all different levels, really. We do super deep, interesting analytical integrations, but also very simple, upcoming matches calendars.
And maybe on the data and the sources that are there, it's one thing differentiating companies is a bit that we don't work with OCR or any measures to scrape data from broadcasts. We work with server data only, that we acquire in official exclusive partnerships with a big share of the top tier rights holders. So talking about data rights, our goal here is really to create official data as an asset that is relevant to tournaments, that is making their business model more sustainable. It's a scalable and organic revenue channel that is correlating with the amount of content that they ultimately do. And this data is valuable for betting, for media. But the beauty is, as you pointed out correctly, different than in traditional sports. The perfect data picture is there. It's like, as a data geek, esports is ultra exciting. You can get everything there, and even if you have like a super sophisticated system in a stadium, triangulating players and trying whatnot, the stuff we have in esports is still more accurate and clean and fast and granular, and this opens up so many avenues. So getting back to the rights thing, since it's the panel topic, we feel this is an area that is under-recognized at the moment, and our vision is really to turn this into something that helps the ecosystem. And we employ, across anything we do, a revenue-sharing model, and it's a very skin-in-the-game driven approach. So we want to align the incentives and do this across all our integrations. And the data you can use is phenomenal. And if you look on the data on the server side of things.
So we have our first question, and I should remind everybody, if you want to submit a question, you can use the app or tweet something. I feel like a streamer. Please like and click below. But this actually leads us nicely into this, because you were talking about kind of doing good and making positive change. And one of the questions that somebody's asked is, how do we feel about more data being delivered to the public to help increase betting markets? I know there's multiple teams multiple people on this panel with that experience. But Will, I'll ask you first of all, do you think it introduces any legal challenges, especially with such a young audience when it comes to esports, that there's more and more data out there that makes betting more and more in depth?
Do you mean does just the simple access to data create any issues? Not necessarily. I mean, you'd hope that provided that the data that is being made available for betting is through licensed betting operators who are properly regulated and proper controls in place, then in theory, no. Having access to more and better data is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I'd say briefly.
Well, Sabina, you were saying not all data is created equal, right?
Right.
So it's important to quantify what kind of data is being put out there in the public.
Right. So, to use Dota as an example, because Dota is like the sexiest data game. We have access to a lot of data, like every player input, and there's also live data that's accessible to the audience. And we've started partnering with betting companies and putting live odds on our sites that are like the highest traffic sites in Dota 2, and we've seen great returns on that. And I don't think there's anything unethical about it. Valve has had some weird legal trouble with like loot boxes and stuff, and has discouraged teams from having betting sponsorships at this last TI, but every team had a betting sponsorship in their name. So it seems like it's not actually being enforced.
But I can understand Valve's stance a bit, looking back at 2016 and the prominence of skin gambling. So they were exposed to, within their entire IP and the in-game items, being used as a wager in a $1 billion completely unregulated gambling ecosystem, which ultimately was not in a position to regulate minors participating or countries that don't regulate gambling. So there are some reservations there. Morally, I believe in betting as a phenomenal engagement driver in sports and in esports alike, but it has to be done in the right way with an integrity-driven approach. And it's something that just goes it's like a red line through our vision in really unlocking the potential of data, that you also give the rights holders some control and transparency in what's going on, because I think that's really important, and that's the way to grow it into a helpful revenue channel for the sustainability of the ecosystem, rather than an area that can invite risk.
Oskar, what do you keep in mind when you think about betting as a revenue source?
Yeah, and linking back to the question about the data being delivered to the public, if you're against betting, of course you'll have trouble with the betting market being improved by increased data. But as long as you don't have a general problem with betting, I feel that more data to the public and better data sources and faster streams, that's just amazing, and we'll be able to build a lot better products, and it's just going to be great for the community, the viewer experience. For everybody as a whole, as long as you're not against betting per se. Right. So, and that's what we're really trying to do, right? We're trying to make all kinds of data for the 18 most popular games available to as many clients across the whole world as possible. So that's something that we really feel strongly about, that it should, more data, more easily accessible to everyone should be great.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily need to be applied for betting, right? I could use it to infuse my choices for like a fantasy league or anything else. So Sabina, somebody's asked specifically, because you mentioned that you keep a couple of variables in mind when you think about data. And specifically when you think about data as it comes to betting odds. If I come to your site and I say, I really want to put a bet on the international, just like I put a bet on the Grand National every year.
Sure.
What are the things that you are keeping in mind when you're providing me data that I can pull from and go off and make my bet?
So I don't think this question is asking like how to calculate betting odds. But what we consider when we're providing betting odds, like we have a pretty sophisticated backend platform for tracking that. We can do by like geolocation and a lot of other different things. We track, the amount of impressions people get, and we can like have a self-serve API where betting partners can just put their odds on our site, and it'll show up when you go to the teams page. It'll show up when you see the live matches there. It'll show up historically, so that way people can be like, man, should have bet on that match. Like, look how much money I would have made, right? But it depends on the level of odds. Like some odds makers will do things like betting on who's going to get the first kill or who's going to die first, and that level of detail, and then we can additionally provide odds to that level because we're the highest traffic data-oriented site for Dota, and we have a lot of users who really care about getting in the data. And we found that partnering with betting sites has been really successful because we genuinely think it enhances the experience for users to see odds when they're looking at the data of a live game. And I also think this is about data odds, but like betting sponsorships of just say esports teams is a huge source of revenue in esports that can't really be undercut, and it's pretty related to data.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we could add something there. I think the question may have also been regarding what the actual variables are important when providing odds, and we do actually calculate probabilities and odds and provide an odds feed to customers. And I mean, the important thing here when you do odds, at least in our take at Abios, is that there's so many data points and there's such rich data in esports that it's very, very important to be super knowledgeable about the games and to know which data points to consider, because you cannot consider every single data point in every single game, because then you'll risk overfitting your models. I mean, if we take tennis as an example, it's been proven, what I've heard, I don't do tennis odds, but when you adjust the live odds, you mainly look at the serve of the players. I mean, if somebody's serving very well, that's like one of the main telling points of how they'll perform during the match and how you should adjust the live odds. I mean, and you need to be very careful in esports and very knowledgeable about each individual game to see like what are the tells and what are the signs and what specific data points do you need to look for when adjusting the odds, and not just including everything, because there is so much.
Mm. Well, I mean, what's interesting as well to me about integrating more data, sort of moving away from betting for a second, integrating more data into any broadcast experiences, it gives equal opportunities for revenue and monetization, right? Because you then provide all these additional opportunities for sponsorship, for logos, for what have you. Is that something that you guys think of when you think of data development in this market as a specific and growing source of potential revenue?
For us, it's a product. That's part of the benefits of being on Grid's platform, that you have access to a lot of things that can be integrated into the broadcast or into the data-related coverage on social media of events. And the commercial driver here is to create premium sponsorship inventory. Data is always an angle betting companies like to take, because usually punters like stats and it drives informed decision making, ultimately betting. But this can work for any other brand as well. And also data and stats are a very safe angle to engage with esports, and this whole talking point of like accessibility, and this is also something that usually resonates really well. So in these areas, I think there's a great, I think it's actually relatively underdeveloped in esports, despite its digital nature as a sport. And that's the kind of niche we're also attacking, because there's a lot you can do. It's quite exciting, and the data is there. So more and more we see this as part of our business model evolving into a quite significant driver.
Yeah, so related to what you said, I think it's absolutely a a huge driver, and there's two reasons. So first of all, I haven't mentioned it, but like one of our largest revenue streams is a B2C subscription model where we provide additional data so that players can analyze games, and that's extremely popular. It's a huge percentage of our revenue. But secondly, like, I'm an American here, and betting just became legal in this huge new market. Like, obviously that's a huge opportunity. What are we going to do with that?
I think data also has the potential to bring in different types of companies and sponsors, right? I'm thinking of SAP and their partnership with Team Liquid. But somebody who's clearly done their homework has asked about whether there's the ability to monetize providing data specifically to viewers rather than to companies. And they reference Riot Games' ProView. Do we feel like that's an opportunity, or do we feel like consumers are going to reject that? They bring up PPV mode as an example of something where that didn't quite work as well.
Many companies are trying, and I think to vault data that is very accessible behind a paywall, you would have to do something exceptional to make it worthwhile for someone to put up a subscription fee. There's other models I see where you can still infuse the data into the broadcast but turn it into something engaging, like a social gambling type of activation where you can use this to raffle away things from a sponsor or skins and make a prediction game out of the data. Like, there's many ways of using data to engage audiences. Data to viewers clearly is a market, and you guys have figured it out because your product is good and you're ahead of the game. But I think it's still a hard ask for an esports viewer who can watch for free and who has data available for free if they know in which places to look, to create an experience that justifies a subscription fee or pay-per-view.
Got it.
I think there's also
I
possibly...
think ProView, sorry, one last thing. The data thing is obviously important, but people love to see the chat. I feel like this is the feature that sells.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be almost sort of cutting your nose off to spite your face in a way, because data has such tremendous value in enhancing the broadcast itself that, you know, a lot of effort has been put into changing the way esports is broadcast to enhance storytelling, to drive engagement, and to make it more compelling broadcast product. And data is fairly essential to that. So to suddenly put data behind a paywall might be counterproductive.
Got it. So we do see some possibilities, but maybe a slower burn or slower adoption than somebody who's, you know.
Yeah, I think most publishers will try to do this in some capacity, though.
Yeah.
And like in the U.S., like fantasy football is huge, so I think we already see fantasy products in esports. I just think we're going to continue to see iterations until something sticks, and that might be a paid product.
Okay. So when we think about data informing a broadcast, then do we think that there's things that are, and we've touched on this briefly, but do we think that there's possibilities in esports that are, you know, particularly creative or groundbreaking that could help, you know, guide the way for, because we know already that traditional sports are looking to esports for inspiration, right? I'm willing to bet there's more than one or two representatives from traditional sports in the room. So what do we think esports can teach traditional sports in terms of data, in terms of how it's integrated and how it's used, either in the ecosystem, in the broadcast? Open question.
I'll take a shot at answering this. I think esports started with a viewing experience that is so different from traditional sports being on digital platforms. What we now see with extensions and more programmatic layers strapped on top of the broadcast will serve as technology sandbox for better viewing engagement, better accessibility of data, and interacting with streamers or competitions alike. And sports are looking at especially this because these are new areas where they can potentially broadcast and engage a demographic that is evading them, or more elusive since the inception of esports. So there will be models that will make just as much sense as they make in esports for a traditional sports broadcast, and I look forward to some of the first adoptions there that will capitalize on this potential.
Yeah, I mean, one of the hard parts to answering this question is that like the main edge that esports has over regular sports is, of course, its digital nature, which we already spoke about, and that we can receive much richer data, a lot faster data, you know, everything. It doesn't have to be, it's not limited to what the eye can see. I mean, we can see everything that's going on at the server, for example, if you connect to the server. So I think that like a lot of the USPs that esports has over regular sports will be hard for regular sports to actually achieve because there isn't as granular data as in esports.
I think also partly because esports, when looking at sponsors, investors, broadcasters, has had to do so much explaining. It has put a lot of effort and creativity into analysing its audience and creating excellent audience data. So, for example, we saw Nielsen and Activision recently sort of partnering to try and develop a good stat for average minute audience as a means of measuring how successful and how far your broadcast reach is. And that's the kind of thing that you'd expect broadcasters, sponsors, investors in the traditional sports industry to start to look at more, to think like, actually, is that a better qualitative measure of how successful this is likely to be?
Got it. Okay, we have just a few minutes left and we have one last question, so I'm going to ask everyone to take it in turn because I think this is sort of potentially a good summary of a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So somebody has asked, what are the main obstacles to monetizing both media and data rights in esports? So I'll ask each of you to think a little bit about that and give us your thoughts. And Oskar, let's start with you.
All right, so I got the least time to think about this one.
Yeah,
but,
apologies.
The main obstacles, I would say, probably two obstacles. One is the accessibility of data. If we're able to access great data, we can make really, really great products. But some of the game publishers are not like Blizzard, who have Overwatch, for example. They're not allowing like any access to any sort of detailed data, not through APIs, not through server access. They're not collaborating with pretty much anybody in the scene, which makes it really difficult for companies such as ourselves to create great products for those games as of right now. So accessibility of data is one thing. And the other thing is, which we don't have to go into, but it's the main obstacle, is delays. And that's delays of data on both ends. So either if it's a delayed feed or if the consumers watching the matches are watching a delayed stream because they're on the other side of the world or whatnot. So there's like several layers to the delay issue which we don't have to go into, but that's one of the huge obstacles.
Well, what do you think?
It's possibly a slightly weird angle to take, but I'd say time is one of the peculiar obstacles to have in that there are a vast number of ideas of how to monetize media and data rights, but actually esports itself is still maturing. There are a vast number of esports tournaments of all different shapes and sizes, and just to take an example from one huge asset, which is your live broadcasting rights, I think it's quite hard to extract maximum value of that value from that, whilst esports is still in its relative infancy, because whether you're a sponsor, you're an investor, you're a broadcaster, you would ideally want to be able to make a long-term, large investment into something which is predictable, has a steady calendar, etc., etc. And the other point I mentioned at the start, just to reiterate, is potential inadvertent consequences of regulatory changes. But I won't go into that now because it's boring.
Not to us, but Sabina.
I think the biggest obstacles for media rights and data rights involve the data of media, meaning like what is a viewer? How do we monetize that? How do you reliably count that? So when you're an investor or when you're an advertiser, and these advertisements are getting more heavily regulated as time goes on, because most legalities and advertisements are a little behind the internet, right? We're still playing catch up. So if we don't know what a viewer is, if we have things like people view botting, if we have not good enough data to invest reliably, then I think we get into these situations where we have like crazy high investments, crazy off things, and then that handicaps the ability to grow, hamstrings the ability to grow the media rights section, and the data rights are related.
Well, I absolutely agree. That's a big one. The uniformity of viewers and the definitions. I disagree with Oskar on the accessibility. I think technologically, as I alluded to earlier, very accessible, great sources. I think the key here is to finding a model that is including a commercial consideration for the rights holder, and then suddenly accessibility is there. This is our business model. When it comes to the obstacle in data rights, there's a lot of unofficial data feed solutions available, and I think, and we're investing heavily, working closely together with our partners to introduce measures both operationally and technologically to protect the official server data, and obviously then in the next step make as many applications as possible run on the official quality real-time feed, which is the goal, because the rights holder wants to be involved in all of these projects that are powered by their data. And rather than having a third party without investing in rights or sharing revenues with them, piggy banking of their data. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the obstacles.
Got it. Okay, we are almost exactly at time, so I'm going to thank everybody for joining me today and ask everybody to give them a round of applause, everybody's panelists today. Thank you, guys.